Hello, I'm Jennifer Pope Baker. I'm president of Women's Fund of Central Indiana, and I am so happy that you are here with us today. We have all the participants are loading into our webinar right now, and so I'm going to chat with you for just a couple minutes while everybody loads in. And Women's Fund likes to start on time, but it's really not fair to start on time if everybody hasn't had a chance to get in. We have almost 100 people who have registered for today's webinar. It looks like about half of you, a little bit more than half, are already in today. I wish it was a beautiful day outside, but I guess every day that we wake up and that we're healthy is a good day. And I know that probably a lot of people right now are feeling physically healthy, but are kind of worried about their emotional well-being, either for themselves or somebody else. And a gray day like today doesn't help with that. And my daughter, Catherine, and I made a pledge to each other, not a New Year's resolution, but a pledge to each other at the beginning of the year that we were always going to try to turn anything we start to say negative into something positive. And it started on a day like this when we're like, ugh, it looks so yucky out. And then we started talking about all the great things about that day, even though the sky was gray. And so I am sure that our panelists will have things that are much more pithy to say on this subject than that. But I wanted to start this morning first by welcoming and introducing you to Leslie Bowles. And Leslie Bowles is the new Senior Director of Philanthropy and Community Engagement for Women's Fund. And not only is she new in this position, but it is a brand new position for Women's Fund. And she'll be responsible for the strategy, management, direction, oversight of all of our fundraising, cultivation, and stewardship for Women's Fund, and also with our marketing and communications. We have a really great story to tell, and we have a really uneven experience in telling that story because of a lack of capacity of woman power to always get it done. And so Leslie is going to help us figure that out as well. So I hope that you all will begin to see in 2021 more consistent, more exciting communication and storytelling from Women's Fund, but it's not probably going to start tomorrow. It's going to take a little bit to get the plan. So right now, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie, who'd like to say hello to you as well.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that warm introduction. I am so happy to be with everyone this afternoon for this informative dialogue about self-care. As Jennifer shared, I'm the new Senior Director of Philanthropy and Community Engagement here at the Women's Fund. I have over 15 years of fundraising experience. I've worked at nonprofits, universities, and foundations in Indianapolis, Chicago, and Louisville. And I am so excited to join the Women's Fund team. I've always been passionate about issues that affect women and girls in our community, and I've used my time to mentor young women, particularly women of color, as they're navigating through college and starting their careers. And I was drawn to the Women's Fund because it has been a force for good in our community for 25 years, and the mission to uplift women and girls resonated so strongly with me. I look forward to meeting all of you, and so over the next couple of weeks, I'll be reaching out to many of you to schedule coffees and virtual meetings, and I look forward to connecting with you. So thank you.
Thanks, Leslie, and welcome. It's been such a joy to work with Leslie. Even though she's only been with us for a couple of weeks, she's already made a strong mark on our work and has been warmly welcomed by everybody on our staff. And another person who is very excited to have Leslie on board with us would be our board chair, Jennifer Dzwonar, who's principal with Borshoff and has been involved with Women's Fund for many, many years. Almost every committee we've had. She's chaired Power of Women's Fund Philanthropy. She's chaired lots of other committees for us and is in year 2 of her 2-year commitment as board chair. And she will be moderating today's panel and introducing you to our panelists. So Jennifer, thank you for everything you do for Women's Fund. It's such a pleasure for me to work alongside you and learn from you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer. Welcome, Leslie. We're so excited to have you. And thank you all for being here today. We are really looking forward to this conversation. As we've all said, that yes, mental health, we are all, if many of us grew up knowing how important it is, this time has really instilled that even more strongly in all of us. And this is a very special topic for me. I grew up as the daughter of a therapist, a woman who also ran the psych unit in a hospital for many years. And she was always instilling us. She walked around in the 80s with a t-shirt that said, "Let's talk about mental illness," and really embarrassed her teenage daughters, but how important that is. Now I need the t-shirt. So we have 3 fabulous women with us today, experts, and we're going to talk with them. You should all have received their complete bios. So I will just say very briefly, Crystal Mehta is a double board certified physician in general psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry. Jasmine Graham is a Ph.D. and an assistant professor in urban education counseling and counselor education. And Cara Berg Raunick is a director of nursing practice and nurse practitioner working in public health. So each of their areas of expertise, very interesting, and would love to have each of your perspectives. And if we could start with a question for all 3 of you, but a question about how are people coping in this post-holiday, very much still in a pandemic era. While this is a tough time of year for a lot of people anyway, and here we are now, but while we've seen political upheaval and while we've seen a lot of other issues going on, you're laughing that my light goes out if I don't move in my office. So here I am moving. There we go. How are people coping, and what are some good strategies that you've seen for coping? And Jasmine, let's start with you, please.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So what a wonderful question, Jennifer. Indeed, these have been tenuous times for many of us as we go about managing our individual and collective lives in the midst of a COVID, a pandemic that none of us would have ever predicted we would be living through. I've seen, and let me shed some light to the context and the lens that I'm bringing in. I am a counselor educator, as you all know. I train mental health and school counselors. I also provide supervision to practicing school and mental health counselors as well. And so what I'm hearing from my supervisees and what I certainly see within my sphere of influence is that people are coping in diverse ways. Those who are successfully coping, I would say, and by successfully, I mean coping with the stress of the pandemic in a way that is not exacerbating mental illness, it's not exacerbating the use of substances, the overuse of substances. I would say they are successfully coping by tapping into their true selves, their creative selves, and the connections that they have in their lives. I would say that there are quite a bit of folks who are not doing well in their coping, and that is certainly understandable. There are folks who are coping by excessive use of substances, and by that I mean maybe smoking or drinking to an excess as a way of coping, numbing oneself from the stress and the pain that we are experiencing individually and collectively. And so there's not one way that folks are coping. I think people are trying to figure it out as they go. But those who are doing well tend to be coping more from a way of accepting and making peace with the situation that we find ourselves in, using creativity, and then falling back on the connections that we are able to maintain and harness, even though many of us are separate from our traditional connections.
Excellent, thank you. Cara, other things that you're seeing in your professional, personal life?
Yeah, so what a complex time. Thank you for having me to speak today. You know, I think as cliche as this is, much of getting through the pandemic boils down to a day at a time. Who could have imagined in March that we would still be here today, right? And as that sort of reality has settled in for us, I think each day, taking stock of the individuality of our situations, we're all in this collectively, but knowing that everyone's experience, everyone's hardship varies and differs, and also their strengths, meaning that today, my personal world, neither my partner nor I have lost jobs. We're okay. Our child is okay. So what does that mean that I have to give today, both to myself and to take care of my small unit? Because it's not ideal, nothing's great, right? But in our kind of okay world, and then looking out into the world for those who are less okay, what do I have today that I can do to give and care for my community as well as for myself? And today that may be different than it is tomorrow, because how I'm doing today may be different than it is tomorrow. One last piece that I want to bring to this, because I get to talk about trauma, right? We're going to talk about some of the depth and hardship, but a sort of positive to leave you with is my husband is a high school choir teacher, and he gave his students recently a writing prompt about sort of their experience over the last year, and expected to get heavy responses. And while there were heavy themes and there was struggle, the universal thing that he shared with me that came out of it was the growth and development and self-reflection that these young people, these high schoolers, have had the time and space for. And so I'm not a big like find the silver lining person and let's make, we don't have to get into toxic positivity, but I think reaching in and finding those places where this has created space to allow us to connect with our deeper selves.
And so much talk about, right, do kids get enough time these days to do that? So that's meaningful. Very interesting. Crystal, your thoughts on how people are doing?
First, I want to, thank you for having me on this panel. I'm very excited about mental health and a big advocate, of course, for mental health. In regards to coping skills, kind of what the other two panelists had mentioned, it varies extensively, right? Person to person. One coping skill may be great for one person, maybe not so great for another. So what I always recommend when I see patients is, if deep breathing does not work, don't think that all coping skills don't work, and to try to vary and try different modalities of different coping skills. A lot of people will listen to music or kind of get into creative writing, journaling, coloring. There's various coping skills that might be beneficial, but they're not universal, essentially. So the biggest thing I think is to try different coping skills. I can share my personal coping skills because I think that that's what I kind of have honed in most for it. And I think the biggest things that have helped me during this pandemic, as Cara had mentioned, I am very fortunate to still have my position. But with that being said, lots of extra stressors going along with having a global pandemic. But some of my coping skills have included trying to exercise. The gyms have opened back up here. So of course, wearing a mask is always going to be beneficial when doing that. I've also incorporated more yoga at home, as well as doing some morning meditation. I do use an app called the Calm app. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with it, but the moderator with the app has a wonderful morning meditation that lasts about 7 to 8 minutes. And I think that just doing that every morning kind of really sets my day up to kind of be in that calm space. In addition, I know some modalities that have been beneficial. I know Jennifer Pope Baker had mentioned kind of the gray, dreary day. And unfortunately, right, the pandemic worsens when the weather's bad, right? The coldness and things like that. And so utilizing a light box has been very helpful for patients that I see, previously, not currently in my current setting. But when I did work in an outpatient clinic, I would recommend a light box during especially the winter dreary kind of months. In addition to coping skills, I think it would be misfortunate if I did not mention medications. As a psychiatrist, that is what I do on a daily basis. I know a lot of people are fearful of psych medications still to this day, but we do prescribe medications, especially even during periods, what we call an adjustment disorder. So kind of during periods where people are adjusting to a significant stressor. And if they feel like that stressor is causing an impairment in their functioning, we sometimes will use medication. And when that stressor gets relieved, the pandemic, things start opening up, able to, live their life without this impairing functioning, then we can always discuss maybe tapering off the medications as well. So I did want to mention that in addition to coping skills, if symptoms are severe enough and you do feel like functioning is impaired, that is also an option that is very useful in conjunction with the coping skills.
Thank you. Yeah, very important point. I have some questions, a question for each of you, and we'll do that now. But for everybody listening in on this, if you have questions, do feel free to put them in the chat. We should have time, even though, as Jennifer always says, we will start on time and end on time. We should have time for some other questions as well. So please do that, and we'll see what we can get to then. Cara, we have heard a lot more, I think we generally in society, and definitely for those of us who have any sort of touch with healthcare system, education system, of trauma-informed care, that we're all getting a little more educated. People, obviously, in all of your line of work have been more informed. But as we look at some light at the end of this tunnel, as vaccines become more available, as we all look at getting out of what may have been a very extended quarantine for a lot of people, or for people who've been working right in the midst of pandemic in a variety of ways. What do you think as we re-enter into more of a trauma-informed care way of looking at ourselves and at the community?
Yeah, thank you for such a thoughtful question. So I think we probably have to start with what is trauma, right? Because I am a big proponent of the idea that trauma at this point is essentially universal, right? That's sort of the baseline understanding that I think I am coming from and that I'm advocating we approach our sort of reentry to society from. And sometimes I say that to people and they get a little confused because I think so often we conceptualize trauma as violence, abuse, war, a car accident, right? And those are sources of trauma. But really, a definition of trauma is something, an event or a series of events that that are experienced by the person to whom they're happening, by that individual, as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. That's broad, right? That can be almost anything. And you'll notice in that definition a lot of personal elements, right? It's how that's experienced by the person. And then also what the long-term effects are, right? So something that experience then also goes forward to negatively impact someone's well-being and their functioning, okay? So I think that in a COVID world, we can take that definition and very clearly see, I think we have all been fearful for our own lives or the lives of our loved ones, right? If you're young and healthy and not worried for your own physical, actual life and death, everything we hear about potential long-term effects and all the unknowns. I remember, at the very beginning when we were really housebound and we'd take these little tenuous walks around our neighborhood and we'd see a neighbor that we loved come out of their home and we would cross the street because they were a threat to my and my family's well-being, right? Everyone has experienced trauma, and that's just that neighborhood walk, right? Forget the people that have lost businesses, lost loved ones, lost livelihoods. So what is trauma informed, other than, as Jennifer said, like a bit of a buzzword right now, right? So what being trauma informed means is really recognizing and realizing how widespread trauma is, and then understanding a bit of the ways that trauma impacts how we move through the world, knowing that it can impact how we receive and process memory, that it literally changes our brain structure, that it literally changes us at a cellular level. It impacts our physical health, our mental health, our coping, our immunity, on and on and on. And starting to recognize some of the signs and symptoms of when someone has experienced trauma. And then how we respond in a way that seeks to respond with care and in a way that resists and minimizes re-traumatization, right? Those are the keys. Kind of, they talk about the 4 R's, right? Realizing, recognizing, responding, and resisting re-traumatization. So how do we apply that? It's different, like you said, if we're talking teaching, if we're talking healthcare, if we're talking the boardroom. But what I think is the most important sort of small mind shift we can make is using these tools and this lens, this sort of lens of everyone has experienced trauma and we need to approach people with that gentleness for everyone. The same way that we are wearing a mask around people, whether they are coughing on us or not, right? We know about asymptomatic spread now. In healthcare, we talk about universal precautions for blood and body fluids, whatever else, right? So we're looking at treating you in this gentle, respectful, thoughtful way, and ourselves, by the way, right? Not because we know you have a history of trauma, not because we know that you were in a violent relationship, not because we know that you lost someone to COVID, but because we're going to assume that your life in the last year has been traumatic, because it has for all of us. And making how to operationalize that's going to look different in every, I'm happy to answer questions. It'll look very different for different situations. But I think one of the general shifts we can make that would make a big difference is that when we encounter someone who is a difficult person, right, or a difficult behavior in our worlds, then instead of looking at that person or situation and saying, what is wrong with that person, to say what happened to that person. That really subtle shift, even just saying it, I physically feel space open up. I feel a difference in the way that I approach and care for and think about that person that's in front of me. And if we move through our world on reentry with that attitude, that's a really powerful start.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah, and I think that, you know, the more trite saying of we don't know what battles other people are fighting has always been a mantra for some of us, but you're right, even more so now that everybody has gone through to some degree something. And I think so much of this, of course, this is Women's Fund. So much of this is women and girls and the impact on them as well. And as women, we're so often the caregivers and those who are more alert to those things, as we know. And so to just use those sixth senses we may have to pick up on other people with gentleness and care, that's such a great reminder. Crystal, as in your work in psychiatry, especially focusing on some of our most vulnerable populations, including those who are incarcerated or people in society, we have learned over the past year more about what people need and how they react to challenging situations. Have we learned more? And if so, what is that? And how can we do some things as a society better going forward than we have in the past, knowing that that could be an all-day conversation, I'm sure, but just wondering what your observations are on that of how, what have we learned, how can we do better?
Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I'm not going to breach the topic of social justice reform because that is, I think, key. So I see them after the fact while they're incarcerated. So within the prison system, the biggest thing that I've noticed, unfortunately, with the pandemic is that we have eliminated in-person visits. And I think that that's been very, very critical for the well-being of all the inmates. So within Indiana, you know, we have adult female and male prisons. We also have juvenile prisons. So I see patients in all of the prisons. However, on a weekly basis, I do see the juvenile patients. And I think that that's been very, very difficult for a lot of these kids, is not having that contact from their support system. Now, we do allow each of the inmates to have a tablet, and they're given a tablet, correct? And so they're able to do Zoom calls, talk on the phone. However, that in-person interaction, I think limiting that has been a very disfortunate for this population. It really kind of hones in on the fact that having that support system is really key, and being able to interact even in person with that support system is critical for the well-being. We have noticed, unfortunately, a major spike in suicide attempts, serious suicide attempts, as well as completed suicides. We do typically see that as an ebb and flow, and around the holidays, we typically see that on an annual basis. However, this year it's definitely been a little bit more significant. I did see some patients at the women's prison last week, and I know that a lot of them are feeling much, much more depressed, and a lot of them kind of share that sentiment of not being able to have that interaction with their families. In addition, not being able to cope appropriately. So a lot of the prisons are on lockdown, so they're not even able to do anything aside from stay in their cells all day. And so I know a lot of them with the pandemic have had a lot of losses as well. And so not being able to use any coping skills that they might find beneficial, I've found has been very, very difficult. With that being said, for the future, it is kind of, without talking about social justice reform, within the prison system, it is very difficult during these trying times to figure out what is the best course of action. With the lockdowns, it's really more of a warden-based decision. So I think maybe incorporating medical would be a little bit more helpful, but that's more of a DOC dynamic. But aside from that, it's been a very challenging time because, these are the most disenfranchised populations that we have, and trying to figure out how we can best serve and assist them when there are, on top of us feeling like we're locked in, above and beyond that, they're, seeing that occur to them substantially, I guess, in a more significant way.
Thank you. Jasmine, as a counseling expert, what are some things that you think we would all benefit from knowing, maybe about ourselves? And how can we all do a better job of being stewards of our own mental health?
So mental health is such an internal process. Often others see the impact, the outward impact of one's internal mental health state. We see it in our loved ones, or even our own, or our shared community members, their daily functioning, how people behave in the grocery store, in the workplace, in their families, right? We see the impact of what's internal, which is our mental health. And we know that the pandemic has especially triggering for symptoms such as depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, suicidality, which some of the panelists have already spoken about. And so I think one way that we can improve our own mental health, as well as take care of our mental health and that of others, is to give voice to our internal states. So again, mental health is such a private, to an extent, certainly internal experience. And often the stigma and the shame around receiving mental health support, whether it's formal, such as therapy or psychiatric medication management, or whether it is informal, such as with chatting with a girlfriend or spouse or family member or clergy member. Often there's stigma and shame around that. And if that stigma and shame is not real, sometimes we certainly feel that the stigma and the shame would be there, because what would happen if anyone knew that we were feeling, questioning whether or not we should continue to live in this world, or questioning whether or not we are concerned about feeling down and feeling blue for a significant period of time. So I think giving voice, giving ourselves permission to share, to open up, to be vulnerable and transparent in a safe space. So finding a place of connection where you can be authentic, and perhaps that would be formal. While many therapists and counselors are offering support in person, some are even offering telemental health. And my colleagues in telemental health, those that provide counseling via online platforms, have seen a huge spike in their patient pools and their wait lists, as people try to find places to release some of the burden that they're carrying internally and externally as well. So first step, eliminate the stigma and shame to the extent that you can. Find a safe place to release. Also, consider ways that you are doing well. And not to be Pollyannish in that way, but I think that we live in spectrum. So many times there are things not going well in life, and then there are things going well. And one way that we kind of pick ourselves up and practice resiliency and practice survivorship is by trying to focus on what are some of the skills that you're using in other parts of your life that seem to be working well, that seem to be bringing you joy, that seem to be opening you up, that seem to be sparking creativity and imagination. How are you doing that in these other areas of your life? And is it possible, even in the midst of a pandemic, to use those same skills in other areas? That is not always possible, but sometimes it is. Also, I think we need to be honest about our boundaries. During this pandemic, we are discovering ways that we are remarkable and brilliant and strong. And man, especially as women, aren't we getting it done, right? But we're also sometimes very tired. We are, at least for me, I'm constantly in front of a screen, right? And I know that I'm not the only one. So we're getting it done. We're being resilient. We're being strong. We are surviving. We're bringing it for those of us who have caretaking responsibilities. We're caring for our parents, our loved ones, our children. But man, we also have to find a place to stop and rest too. So I think acknowledging boundaries and putting boundaries in place for yourselves, ourselves, is a key way to manage mental health. In my home, everyone knows I need a quiet moment in the morning, the longer the better, and I need quiet time in the evening. If mama doesn't get that, mama's not a happy camper. And so I've shaped my family dynamics in that way, and I haven't had too much pushback. Okay. And the very last thing I would say, let's try to maintain connections as much as possible. Often the isolation associated with mental health issues is been exacerbated during COVID because we're separated from one another. Depression and anxiety, suicidality, the overuse of toxic substances, that tends to become even worse when we're isolated and we're alone. So seeking ways to be connected with folks is also really important.
Thank you. I was in a different conversation with all women recently on self-care. And as you said, that stigma and shame is not just about it could be about the depression, but it can also just be about small feelings of loneliness, that we're not good in American culture of admitting loneliness. Because we just think there must be something wrong with us if we're feeling that way. But when women especially have been able to reach out to just one other friend or maybe a couple and say, can we just get on the phone together? Or let's just, try to, if you could do a walk outside or whatever it is that you could do. But that hopefully this period has helped us all to get a little bit more comfortable with reaching out in some way when we need support, either to be a support or to receive support. So thank you for that. We've had a couple of questions that I think are quick answer ones, and that is for Crystal to describe what a light box is, because you mentioned it, and then for Cara to repeat the 4 R's. So if we could do that, those would be quicker answers. We'll get to some others.
Sure, I actually just was typing out a response.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Oh, good.
so you guys have that as well. So I personally use a light box. I started using it when I was in residency. And, it's more geared towards people that do have seasonal affective disorder. I think a lot of us can benefit from it, but it's not going to, like every modality, may not work for everyone. But I do use it in the morning for at least 20 minutes. I have it in my bathroom. So while I'm getting ready, the light shines kind of on my face. One thing that I do remember is that it does have to be at least 10,000 lux for it to kind of really be beneficial. I know there's lots of light boxes on the market, so I would recommend doing research before you do purchase one. I know there's lots on Amazon that you can purchase, and I believe that's where I got mine as well.
Excellent. And then the 4 R's, Cara, if you could repeat those.
Yeah. So this comes from SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and I also have this typed out, so I will send it so you can, depending on your learning style. So really, it's realizing how common and widespread trauma is. It's recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. And then it's responding, in a way that is based on an understanding and knowledge of trauma, and then in a way that works hard to minimize re-traumatization.
So realize, recognize, respond. Was there a fourth? Or is it the
Resist re-traumatization.
Resist.
Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. Am I missing any other questions in the chat? Anything that any of you've each sort of alluded to it in terms of mentioning women in this period. Is there anything in particular that you see? And I loved what you were saying, Jasmine, about we can be both brilliant and strong and tired really in any given moment, all of the above. But things that women and perhaps girls as well can be doing to be more in touch with and using those gifts that we may have of supporting ourselves and supporting others. And I think somebody has alluded to as well, just the idea that we could fall into our own substance abuse issues, and we know, there's certainly many social aspects that accompany alcohol, but we could also use that too much and go down some negative things. But anything about women in particular that you've seen as positive or coping skills to be especially wary of?
So I would say for women in particular, it seems to me that women and children are really taking a huge brunt of the stress and strain of living within a pandemic. And so I would say the very things that I mentioned, being honest about your authentic experience. If you need to rest. If you're having a tough day, you're having a tough day. Just meeting yourself where you are. I think so many times in general, and I really mean just in general, women are conditioned to kind of push past their experience, to keep going, for the sake of for others. But I think these are times where we need to just honor our own experiences a bit more and be honest about that and find places to share that honesty. Some folks like to journal. I think maybe Crystal mentioned earlier that some coping skills don't work for everyone. And so journaling is a way to be in touch with your own authentic experience. And that may not be the coping skill for everyone. Other folks who may be more extroverted may want to hop on a chat or text or meet a friend and walk and talk if possible. But I think finding ways to make sure that at the very least, you are in touch with your own authentic experience, you are in touch with your well-being, and whether the way you communicate that will largely be dependent on your personality and your preferences. Again, if you're introverted, you may want to communicate that one way. If you're extroverted, another way. But the primary goal is for you as a person, as a woman, to be in touch with how well you're doing or not. Maybe you're not doing so well, and to then resist the stigma and the shame and receive some type of help for your own wellness. And that wellness for you could look like a number of things: formal or informal counseling, perhaps the use of medication management to help you as you develop your wellness plan. But again, you being in touch with your own well-being and your own mental health is going to be the first step. So having awareness.
Excellent. Sally in the chat asked a great question. What if you are somewhere of sort of dreading the coming out of this, so to speak? What if a sort of getting back to normal, in quotes, whatever that looks like for you, is not something that you're especially relishing? Any thoughts on, as we pass through these next, what we think will just be the next few months, but thoughts on that?
I can start. I think yes, that's appropriate. Yes, that's normal, right? I don't know that returning to normal is supposed to be the goal, because I'm not sure that normal was so healthy in the first place, right? And many terrible things have happened as a result of COVID, and no one is trying to minimize any of that. But it also gave us the space to recognize what patterns were not working. And I think for a lot of us, that busyness, that perpetual grind, the overextension, especially for women as we balance our communities, our families, our jobs, whatever, right? Wow, what a difference it was when all of a sudden my entire calendar was blank. And what do weekends mean now, right? And I share with you not being eager to go back to that perpetual unthinking grind. And we don't have a roadmap for that, right? So for those of you in positions of power, who are leaders in your businesses and communities, thinking really, really carefully about, God, we all learned how to work from home and we're missing the connection, but what does it mean? Does this allow you to have a more flexible policy? What does it mean that my entire office is used to my 4-year-old running into this room without her pants on and joining in on any of our meetings, right? And they watched me lose my cat, and like all the things, right? Like we've blended those lines in a new way. And in some ways that's bad and we miss boundaries, and in others it's good. And so how can we take some of the good and the bad from all of this? One last piece that's a little different than the question, but that I think is really important. I think there's a little bit, for some people I've been hearing, a new level of anxiety in this in-between phase. We knew the rules when things were shut down, and we knew the rules of the old way. But now some of us are vaccinated and some of us aren't. And some schools are in and some are out. And what does that mean as there's more ambiguity again? And I think it's really, really normal for people to be experiencing some anxiety as some people get back into things. There's new FOMO when everyone was right. So I think that's another really normal space to explore and to know you're not alone.
Excellent. I think also the not judging either yourself or others seems like a really important learning, because so often we can, be it on social media, any other media that we are experiencing, we say, oh, everybody else, really like dresses up and gets into these things for their work. Other people are like, no, don't do that. You should stay in your pajamas all day and, throw a hat on and just deal. And I think to decide what other people should be doing and what works for you are very different things. So I think, that feels like a part of your own mental health and dealing with as well. Thank you for that question, because I think that's a great point, Cara, as we're in this in-between stage. Even as offices, we're trying to figure out, is it okay for people to come in? Well, for some, yes. And then for others, they're not going to be comfortable yet. And then whether you continue to do it from home, does that make you more productive, less productive? Does it also make you mentally healthier, or do you feel less healthy? And then if you have small children at home, few of you on the call do, it's both a gift to be home with them. And then sometimes I find those are my colleagues who are most rushing into the office, who are like, okay, in order to work, I need to be somewhere else. So how you deal with that as well. And Jasmine, to build on something you had, I know for myself, I didn't realize some of the things I needed until I had just gotten up the energy and gone and done it. I didn't realize it, and I needed to walk outside with my friends until I actually went and did it. It felt like too much effort to actually go do it. But once I did it, oh my goodness, what a difference in my mental state. So just to kind of get yourself up and doing it is easier said than done sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Maybe not relying so much on our feelings and relying on our knowledge that, okay, this will be good for me. I don't feel like doing it, but it will be good for me. I want to circle back around to Cara's words were so nice and refreshing just now. And it made me think, wow, I am so excited to see, and also drawing upon Sally's question, which I think is so appropriate. But I'm so excited to foresee the second and third and fourth acts that some people are going to develop for themselves and manifest for themselves after this. I think sometimes we can draw meaning from dread, we can draw meaning from any anxiety that we're feeling. And for some people, I suspect that some of the anxiety and dread could be, that life wasn't working for me, or that profession wasn't, I just it didn't give me joy like it used to, or it just didn't spark my creativity, or man, I found over this pandemic that I'm really good at whatever else, right? And I think we're going to see some folks who just create second acts for themselves, third acts for themselves in ways that maybe they didn't even predict maybe a year or two ago. And I think that is so exciting.
That's wonderful. Yeah, people have turned hobbies into vocations or managed to do. Crystal, is there anything else you could, I'm sure there's lots more, but I'll ask it as, in terms of medications and knowing that, antidepressants and things like that have become, for many people, more common, or we know more people who have relied on them or come to see them as helpful. Any guidance that you have around being a family member, a spouse, a sister, friend to somebody, or what are some of those things to look for that might make a medication answer a good route to go?
So the biggest thing that we typically, look for is buy-in, right? The patient has to want to get better in a sense, but also willing to take the medication. One thing that I do see, unfortunately, when I did work in an outpatient clinic, was some non-compliance with medicine, and that can sometimes be more detrimental than beneficial when you stop and start a medication. But I think the biggest factor when I look at prescribing, I tend to be a little bit more on the conservative end. Unfortunately, I think in the society that we live in, everyone wants a quick fix, right? Let me take a pill for this, pill to lose weight, a pill to do lots of different things, right? And so like I said, I tend to be a little bit conservative, but when the depression or anxiety is impairing functioning, that's where I get really concerned. So if it enables or it hinders your ability to get up in the morning and go to work, or take care of your daily needs, take care of your ADLs, just normal daily activities that are becoming impairing, and enables, or sorry, it stops you from hanging out or being social with others. Even, granted with the pandemic, that has been limited for everybody, but even kind of making that phone call, doing that chat, I think those are when we get more concerned, and then would recommend a trial of a medication.
Thank you. Lacey has a great question about, she works in HR and is wondering if you have any free resources, in other words, other resources that people could tap into that you would recommend as people are hurting, and it may be professionally, personally, but as people are more challenged financially too, but things that that people, she says, they're unable to afford the medical bill after the work insurance pays their part. Other resources that you've seen as helpful, or places that you might direct someone to?
Jennifer, is that for everyone?
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Any of
Cara mentioned NAMI earlier. That's a great resource. Crystal mentioned the Calm apps, also a great resource.
NAMI is the National Association of
Mental, I think it's mental illness. Even I mean, I need to catch up with the times.
So too. But NAMI, right? As a website or resource to go to. Thank you. Sorry, you were saying the Calm app.
Crystal mentioned the Calm app earlier. I would also add counseling.org, and that will link you to the American Counseling Association, and they have a ton of resources that are very broad, and that could hopefully speak to a variety of mental wellness issues.
Thank you. I think Jerry put NAMI Indiana link in the chat. So excellent. It's very helpful.
Also, since I am a pediatric psychiatrist, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, on their website, their national website, they do have a section called Facts for Families. And I think when I did work in an outpatient clinic, that was very useful to print out those resources for family members as well.
Would that be an answer to another question in terms of if people think they have a friend or family member in crisis? Is that a good place to go for things like that?
Not necessarily in crisis. This is
Okay.
for families. So in regards to, my child is feeling anxious, it'll have a lot of resources in regards to that. Now with emergent, I'm not sure on all available resources for that. I always, if there's a family member that is emergently struggling, we always recommend calling emergency services if it gets to that point.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Any other thoughts as we look at, I think, this whole idea of just being that in a 12-step program or many others, the first step is just acknowledging that there's an issue. And I have seen that both in myself and in others seems what is the first deep breath that you can take and say, okay, I just recently had a weekend myself where if I wasn't 100%, I was probably more like 20%. It was just not it wasn't a productive weekend. I didn't feel good. And it just makes you realize sometimes, and you could really beat yourself up on days like that and say, this is, I should be doing more. I should be feeling better. I don't have COVID. I, should just be doing. And you realize sometimes you just have to get to those low states in order to appreciate the high ones. And also to just kind of admit there's an issue. I'd also like to think it's made us more sympathetic for as we talk about in our normal whirling lives. As was mentioned, we're so busy and taking care of others and doing our work. And in many ways being sometimes very selfless and other times very selfish in our normal. And when we stop and just breathe, we pay more attention both to our own heads and hearts, but also to other people's as well. And can maybe look for some of those resources and ways to help. Any other questions or final thoughts as we are just about 5 minutes from the end? Anything that you wish that people knew about resources or even maybe thoughts of hope as we look forward? Anything that any of the three of you have as you've seen personally or professionally for reasons that 2021 might be looking like a better, brighter time ahead?
I think what I would leave us with is just remembering that you're not alone. That just the number of people that showed up today tells us we're not alone. That whether you are at that low 20 or at your 100, feeling really grateful for what you have, or mourning the loss of the year, right? You're not alone. And figuring out how you tap into your network, even when we're from afar, is where I'll leave it, I think.
Shelley, who's with Women's Fund, just made a great comment too of just giving people more grace, and that is both ourselves and others, and finding these different paths. And we're so grateful that there are women like you in our community and men and many in our community who are working across the spectrum. And I keep hoping as a mother of college age sons that more people are going into these fields too, go into mental health fields. Because in the boards that I serve on and programs I'm involved with, I think more and more people are waking up to we need more counseling accessible to people. We need more resources available to people. And if we can get more people interested in this as a field and a helping profession, I think that would be would serve all of us really well as a community as well. And we thank you for how you have served Women's Fund, both as individuals and sharing your expertise with us is really important. And we will keep this conversation going as we move into this next period of continued challenges across a whole spectrum, potentially seeing some improvement in some areas, but as we haven't even talked about some of the bigger areas. Can you see my light is still off? But also other social traumas and social ills that are going to take much longer to address, that we can all work together as women to be the very best and strongest that we can be for each other. So thank you so much for that. If people have other topic ideas, please do pass them along as well, because we want to continue this conversation of mental health and being a support to each other. So thank you all so much for your time. Have a wonderful rest of the day and week. And we will look forward to getting together in person at some point when we all can. Thank you. Take care.